Okay. I know some folks are getting settled here, but I also recognize that we need to make up a little time, and we will. I'm going to ask our speakers to make sure you hit your time, and if you can shave a few minutes off, I'll be eternally grateful. So, as you see in your program, the first set of papers are all focused on a very general goal of keeping guns from dangerous people. Professor Cook identified not only that the Brady Law has not been effective in addressing at least the problems of homicide and suicide, but identified several reasons for that. And so I think it's our job now, in terms of informing future policy, to really address what are those vulnerabilities, what do we know about what happens when you address those. So that's really what the many of the remaining papers will be on. So our next presenter is Janie Roundtree. She is the Chief Operating Officer for Mayors Against Illegal Guns that you've heard so much about, and it's been such a amazing force in terms of advancing evidence-based gun policies. Janie's going to talk to us about critical issues with respect to the records for the instant background check. Janie.
Thanks, Daniel. I've been working for Mayor Bloomberg for about 4 years now, and the staff, most of the staff for Mayors Against Illegal Guns are actually staff for Mayor Bloomberg, who co-founded the coalition 6 years ago with Mayor Menino. We have about 25 staff in New York, 10 in DC, and about 10 around the country. And I will say that working on public safety issues for the mayor, I've noticed a trend that where violent crime tends to increase during the warmer months in the summer and tends to decline when it's cold in the winter. And based on the temperature of the room today, I'm pretty sure that the audience will stay in line. But no, it's actually great. It will keep us all lively here this morning. As the mayor mentioned, Mayors Against Illegal Guns was really founded about a very simple principle, which is that it's possible to respect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens while doing more to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. Mayors really see this issue from a unique perspective, I think, as public officials. They're responsible for driving crime down in their cities. They're looking for evidence-based, practical solutions that they can implement that will save lives. They're less about the ideology of the issue. And I think there was a recognition 6 years ago that the debate about gun policy had become so polarizing, or had become so polarized, and the rhetoric was so polarizing that there was really a space for mayors to talk about solutions in a way that was productive. Since then, as working for the mayor, I've conducted 3 undercover investigations for him into illegal gun sales, whether at gun shows or online. And I wanted to mention that because so many of the researchers here today have supported that work. I remember when we started looking at gun shows, Garen Wintemute showed us the ropes and took us around. You'll see footage from our gun show undercover investigation, I believe, later on today. Daniel Webster has been instrumental in helping us investigate dealers. Mayor Bloomberg mentioned that earlier today. So I think Mayor Bloomberg outlined as an organization, what we want to do in Congress. We want to do 3 things: require a background check for every gun sale, limit access to high-capacity magazines and assault weapons, and strengthen our federal gun trafficking laws. If you ask any advocate in the space, I think that if you had to, hopefully we'll get everything we want, but if you had to pick one thing that will drive down crime in this country and save lives, it will be improving the background check system. And I think that's, at least I speak for myself, our top priority. Phil Cook gave a great overview of the weaknesses in the current system. And I want to focus today a little bit on, I think it was his third actually weakness that he identified, which is that the background check system is only as good as the records that inform these decisions. So I want to take you back, I guess it was 5-6 years ago now, to the Virginia Tech shooting. I'm sure many of you remember that as one of the worst mass shootings in the history of our country. The shooter in that case had been adjudicated mentally ill by a court in Virginia, and the court record was never forwarded to the instant background check system. And then the shooter after that passed several national instant background checks and was able to purchase handguns. He then used those handguns to shoot 32 people at the Virginia Tech campus before taking his own life. This really threw into stark relief the problem that these records are not in the system. It's not an academic problem, it's not a data problem, it's a problem that's putting hands in the guns of mass murderers. Immediately after that shooting, Congress passed a bipartisan law to try to motivate states to get these records in. They can't, by law, force states to report them, but so the law had a carrot and stick approach. The stick was that if you are a state that's failing to report mental health records to the system, you would, if you're not hitting a target, you're going to have parts of your JAG burn federal grant money penalized. The carrot is that it authorized a lot of funding to help these states improve their system. There was a recognition that it's very difficult if a state has not even started this process of collecting and reporting mental health records, that without funding and technological improvements, it was going to be difficult for them to do that. Several years later, we had a mass shooting in Tucson, Arizona, and the circumstances around the gun buys there were complicated. But the shooter in Tucson did reportedly fail a drug test when applying for admission to the Army. There was conflicting accounts about that, and admitted on his form while seeking employment for the Army that he was a drug abuser. By federal law, the Department of Defense or the Army is required to report records of drug abuse to the background check system. He passed a background check within a year of that, and this again threw into stark relief that this issue of adequately reporting records to the system is putting guns in the hands of mass shooters. After the Tucson shooting, our organization did a comprehensive investigation into this problem. What's really happening here? You have 50 states. Many of them are not reporting records into the system. Why not? And are they? So we obtained data from the FBI, and we know actually as of last month that there are still 19 states in the country who are reporting fewer than 100 mental health records into the system. That means that there are 19 states where anyone who would be disqualified from buying a gun because of their mental health history will pass a background check, even if they're not buying from a private seller and not undergoing the background check. That's a huge problem. When we look at why this is happening, what we did was we conducted 60 or more phone interviews with state officials from 49 states and just picked up the phone and said, what's going on? Which I think may not be the most scientific approach, but we learned a lot. And I have a brief presentation to hear today and don't have slides, and all of the results of these interviews are available online through our organization's website if you're curious to read them. A few things really stood out. One major barrier to states reporting these records are their state privacy laws. So the state legislature has to come together, have enough political will to pass a law mandating reporting of these records. It's important to note for people who focus on privacy issues that when a mental health record goes into the National Instant Background Check System, nobody can access it unless you're a law enforcement official running a background check for the purpose of guns. So no state official, no gun buyer, no gun dealer, no one has access to that information. So we recently looked at the data again, and we saw that 19 of the 21 best performing states in terms of per capita record submission have passed a state law. There's a huge association between passing these state laws to overcome privacy concerns and successfully reporting records. Other issues are more technology-based. Pennsylvania has 278,000 mental health records in their state system and can't figure out how to get them into the federal system. I know that's something that the newly elected Governor Kane will be focusing on as she moves forward. That's a technology problem. And then a huge problem is funding. So of the 10 states that have done the most, have improved the most over the last 2 years since we started our investigation, 8 of them have received significant funding from the federal government. I just want to pause here and take a step back from the researcher and say something as an advocate. It was fascinating in last year's federal budget that the administration proposed a budget that had $4 million of funding for this problem. The authorization is $187 million. $4 million would cover Florida alone. The Republican House increased the budget to $12 million. And what I find so interesting about that is that Chairman Wolf, who's from Virginia doesn't actually receive this money, but it was the work of the Virginia Tech families over years and years and years of going into those offices and explaining why this is so critical. Governor McDonald in Virginia and Chairman Wolf in Virginia made sure that the funding appropriation increased in the Republican House, and then the Democratic Senate reduced it a little bit, and we've been under a continuing resolution, which is a talk for another day. that the funding is critical. So I'm running out of time, and I promised Daniel that I would not go over. I'll just leave by saying this, that we have seen tremendous improvement in this. Part of it is shedding light on the problem. Part of it's working with governor's offices and having people reach out to them. This is a problem that can be solved. To go back to the first problem that Phil Cook identified in the background check system, even if we got all of the records in, which I think we can, it's still legal to buy guns without a background check in this country. And I'll just leave you with this one story. About 18 months ago, I think, a young man was adjudicated mentally ill and was blocked from buying a gun in the state of Oregon. Oregon has been reporting its records. He then went to the southwest border and found a private seller online, called that private seller, met him in a parking lot, bought a gun, took it to Pittsburgh, and shot 8 people in a psychiatric hospital. So you're going to hear this over and over again throughout the conference. The number one thing we can do is to require a background check for every gun sale. We have to get the records in, but we've got to do that first part. And I'm very hopeful we can do it. There's tremendous consensus. 74% of NRA members want to do this, 82% of gun owners, over 90% of Americans. We're starting to hear it on the Hill from people you wouldn't expect to be allies. I've met many gun owners doing the investigations I've done for the mayor. They want this too. I just think we have to come together and do it. So thank you, Daniel, for letting us be a part of today.
Thank you, Janie. I'll just remind people we will have a little bit of time when we finish this panel for some open question and answer and discussion. Our next paper, the first author is Dr. Jeffrey Swanson. Dr. Swanson is a world expert in the connection between mental illness and violence, and more recently looking at the gun policy issues. Dr. Swanson, however, is having some voice problems, so his co-author, Linda Frisman, is going to make the presentation. She's a research professor at University of Connecticut.
Good morning. First, let me apologize in advance for not being Jeff Swanson. I'm going to do my best to deliver his presentation, and hopefully he'll be able to do some of the discussion later on. So we're going to be talking about the impact of gun restrictions on people with mental illness and their violent behavior. I want to give a quick acknowledgement to our collaborators from Duke and from Connecticut, and of course to our research sponsors, the NSF and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So let me start by setting the stage and answering the question, which mentally ill folks are prohibited from buying a gun? These are people who are either committed to a mental institution, have ever been, or who have been adjudicated as a mental defective. Now, this is language that has no clinical meaning today, and most advocates consider it stigmatizing and offensive. Specifically, as defined in the regulations, you can't buy a gun if you have been deemed to be dangerous due to your mental illness, to have been incompetent to manage your own affairs due to a mental illness, to be incompetent to stand trial, or to have been acquitted by reason of insanity. Unfortunately, that 1968 law was ineffective because of everything you've heard about earlier about the loopholes. And later, some of these loopholes were closed up when they instituted national background checks through the NICS system. Today, people are asking the question, Today, people are asking the question, can these laws be effective in limiting access to people for those rare individuals with a mental disorder who possess a risk of real violence? When the majority of people with mental illness in the community are just not violent. The problem with the categorical exclusion against mental illness is that people with mental illness are really just people with a full range of human characteristics. They are not defined by their mental illness alone or by having a history of involuntary commitment, and their behavior is not predicted or explained by psychopathology. So how does the state implement this federal law? Identify dangerous people in a background check process and deny them their access to guns. Connecticut began reporting mental health records to the NICS in early 2007. We have an automatic transfer of gun disqualifying mental health records through a black box system between the mental health agency and the state police, who have reporting authority. Now, this is just their identities. I have to say that the confidential psychiatric records are not released to anyone outside of the mental health authority. Since we began reporting these records, Connecticut has reported in the first year 3,000 records, and by 2013, about 14,000 records have been reported to the NICS system. It's still considered a partial failure by the Mayors Against Gun Violence, which, as you heard earlier, released a report last year tallying the number of mental health records each state has submitted to the NICS and ranking each state's reporting. It has, on this website where we're showing you here, it includes an interactive map titled Fatal Gaps: Can Dangerous People Buy Guns in Your State? The not so implicit message here is that states' spotty reporting of mental health records to the background check database is partly to blame for senseless deaths and mass shootings. But the real question is, does the NICS reporting work at all? Is it effective in reducing gun violence? And if it doesn't, then what? And are there policy approaches? That was our question. And this is where empirical research is so much needed. These are the central objectives of our study in Connecticut. Now, we're also carrying out this study in 2 other states, in Massachusetts and New York. But Connecticut is the first state where we've been able to conduct the analyses. So you see here our aims. First, to examine the prevalence and the patterns of different kinds of firearms and disqualification in a large sample of people diagnosed with serious mental illness in the state. In other words, to find out how much overlap there are between these groups. Secondly, to compare the rates of violent crime in people with and without gun disqualifying criminal records and mental health records, to find out how well does the federal law identify those at increased risk of violence, and then to evaluate whether the federal background check policy, as implemented by having states report mental health records to the NICS, can be effective in reducing violent crime. And specifically, we were examining the effectiveness of the policy both in a heterogeneous population of people with serious mental illness, including many who are also involved in the criminal justice system, but we looked at a subgroup that's more homogeneous, people who are mental health service users, excluding people with gun disqualifying criminal records. So apart from the gun disqualifiers, then would the NICS make a difference? This slide shows our study design and our data. We started with a large sample of 23,000 adults with serious mental illness who received services in the public mental health system in Connecticut over the period from 2002 to 2009. Our sample selection included those only who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression, and who had at least 1 psychiatric hospital admission in the study. That second point is especially important because it really changes the nature of the overall population. As you'll see very soon, there's a difference between the people that enter our group and general people who have mental illness in the community. We matched and merged longitudinal administrative data sets from multiple state agencies and put together their demographic and clinical characteristics, their gun disqualifying mental health adjudication records, their gun disqualifying criminal records, their arrests and criminal conviction outcomes, their hospital stays and incarceration stays. The last being important because we controlled for time at risk in the community. And we conducted a quasi-experimental analysis comparing the trends in violent crime among people with and without gun disqualifying mental health records before and after the state began doing the reporting to the NICS in 2007. Now, I also wanted to mention, in terms of our methods, that we configured the data in person-month observations. So we looked at 1 month per person. So if you look at 23,000 people times 96 months, this is over 2 million person months that we examined. Now, you may have noticed that we selected violent crime as our key outcome measure rather than gun crime. Somewhat unfortunate, but this is why we did it. First of all, a substantial proportion of our sample, or 39%, had been convicted of a violent crime at some time during the 8-year study period. On the other hand, only 4% of the sample had convictions specifically involving firearms. And why was that? Well, we looked at a report from the Office of Legislative Research in Connecticut that showed that 92% of firearms violations in Connecticut do not result in convictions due to plea bargaining and consolidation of charges. So it's not a very specific measure. So firearms conviction was not available to us in a real sense, so we had to use violent crime conviction as a proxy for gun use. On the plus side of doing that, violent crime and gun use in crime are highly correlated, so it does make sense to use this as a proxy. And also, violent crime is the important public health and safety outcome, and arguably the distal goal of reducing illegal use of guns. Quickly, let's look at the demographic characteristics. I mentioned earlier that because we were looking at a hospitalized population, they were a little bit different than what you'd expect if you're used to looking at epidemiological data from in terms of mental health. As you can see, 62.5% of them are male. That's higher than usual. The ethnic breakdown is not that different. 62.7% are non-Hispanic white, 18.4% were African American, 16.6% Hispanic, and 2.3% other races. And you can see the breakdown of the diagnostic categories there. But the most important thing really is that first of all, that 64% are under the age of 40, so they're quite a young group. And also, you can see down the bottom right that 85.9% have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder. This is roughly twice as what you would see in an ordinary state system, such as ours, actually, and entirely because we selected for people in the hospital. Now, I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time and move on to the graph that is based on it, which I think gives you better information anyway. This shows how the population breaks out. Of the 23,000 people with at least one hospitalization, 60.3% of them did not have any disqualifying factors at all. Then we can see that 34.9% had a disqualifying criminal history. And down in that little brown circle, you can see that 32.7% of them, that's all they had. They didn't have any mental health. So that's a very important group to consider in terms of alternatives. But in terms of disqualifying mental health history, 7%, that's a very small percent, had a disqualifying mental health history. And out of those, 4.8% also were disqualified and were overlapping with the people with criminal history at a rate of 2.2%. Now, again, not going into too much detail, I just wanted to be able to show you the unadjusted frequencies of violent crime by gun disqualifying mental health status and NICS policy. And these are too much detail to report to you, but let me just say that that you can see that there was a decline in that box of over 50% in the estimated annualized crime rate in the subsample, comparing before to after NICS. So this is the subsample of people who were legally disqualified but not criminally disqualified. And but that, of course, is not a causal relationship because we need to put in the controlled analysis. Okay, so now I'm giving you the key findings from the multivariable analysis. We have the risk factors for violent crime in people with mental illness as found in the general population again. We're more likely to commit violent crime if you're young, if you're male, if you're African American, if you're Hispanic, or if you're a substance abuser. And I should point out that being African American and being Hispanic are really proxies for social and economic disadvantage, which we did not measure and could not measure directly. Secondly, in terms of the criminal record disqualification, people with a gun disqualifying criminal record were 1.6 times more likely to commit a future violent crime than people with no disqualifying criminal record. So what we've really seen here is that having a gun disqualifying record is a marker for violent crime recidivism. And since the existing gun laws did not prevent them from doing that, it appears that they may have obtained guns if guns were involved on the secondary market. So now let's look at the effect of mental health record disqualification. In the pre-NICS period before 2007, people with a gun disqualifying mental health record were significantly more likely to commit future violent crime than their counterparts without a disqualifying record. That this reflects the underlying baseline correlation between the dangerousness criteria in the civil commitment, the disqualifier, and the violent crime, the outcome, and it affirms the federal criteria. So in other words, we did see an effect for the NICS on this group of people. It suggests that the law in the books alone does not sufficiently reduce risk. And so what was the overall findings? First of all, we would have to say we have mixed results because in the total sample, including people with criminal disqualifiers, there's no NICS effect. There's no significant reduction in violent crime risk from pre to post NICS periods in people with a disqualifying mental health record. But in the subsample without criminal disqualifiers, there is a pattern consistent with a NICS effect, that significant reduction in violent crime risks from pre to post NICS period with people with a disqualifying mental health record. They were declined from annualized rate from 6.7% to 3.1%. And you can see these results graphically in these two figures side by side. On the left, you can see that these two groups, the mental health disqualified and the not mental health disqualified in the full sample, so that's everybody, looking at everybody, they are different groups, but they never change their slope. So the effect of the NICS is not shown here. But on the right side, when you look at just the subsample without prior criminal disqualification, then there is a crossover. There is a significant effect of the NICS because there's a greater drop in the rate of people who've been mental health disqualified from owning guns in their rate of violent crime. Okay, so in conclusion, the existing federal criteria for mental health prohibitions on firearms are far from perfect. They appear to have both over-conclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. However, they are correlated with increased baseline risk of violent crime in this study. So we now have at least some evidence from one state suggesting that having a mental health adjudication record archived in the NICS can significantly reduce risk of a first violent crime in people not already disqualified by their criminal record. So achieving comprehensive state reporting of mental health records to the NICS may help reduce violent crime, which is facilitated by guns, and thus improve public safety. A caveat is that our study has several limitations and may not generalize well to other states. Among people with mental illness who have a history of criminal offending and involvement with the justice system, existing law and policy designed to prevent access to firearms through federally licensed gun dealers is likely to be of limited effectiveness. Efforts to prevent gun violence in known criminal offenders with mental illness should also focus on reducing socially determined criminogenic risk factors and improving community-based mental health outcomes for justice-involved persons. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter will be Dr. April Zioli. Dr. Zioli is an assistant professor of criminal justice at Michigan State University and what I consider to be a real rising star studying violence and intimate partner violence and public health applications, sort of a bridge between public health and criminology. April?
Hi, so I'm here to talk to you today about policies to limit batterers' access to guns. In 2010, 1,082 women and 267 men were killed by their intimate partners. The majority of these homicides were committed with guns. Most intimate partner homicides are committed with guns, as you can see from this graph, from this pie chart, tracking homicides from 1976 to 2005. Domestic violence incidents that involve guns are more likely to end in homicide than domestic violence incidents that involve knives, other weapons, or bodily force. In the hands of violent intimates, guns increase the risk of intimate partner homicide, with one study estimating that there's a 5-fold increased risk. The evidence is pretty clear. In the hands of violent intimates, guns constitute a real and fatal threat. Fortunately, there are opportunities for intervention with this group. There's a history of male-to-female domestic violence in most of the relationships of men and women who are killed by their intimate partners, making domestic violence against the female partner the leading risk factor for intimate partner homicide, regardless of the gender of the victim of homicide. Stalking is also an important risk factor for intimate partner homicide, with one study estimating that 76% of homicide victims and 85% of near homicide victims were stalked by their intimate partners in the time preceding the homicide or near homicide event. Now, women often go to the criminal justice system and to the courts for redress. They go to complain about domestic violence and stalking. They go to petition for criminal charges against their batterers, and they go to petition for domestic violence restraining orders. And often when they do this, it is in the context of separating from or just having separated from their abusers. Research suggests that that first year after separation is when women are at the highest risk of intimate partner homicide. So this is a time when intervention, all the interventions we can muster, are really needed. In response to this risk and to the danger of guns in the hands of violent intimates, the federal government passed a couple of laws in the mid-1990s. The first prohibits purchase and possession of guns from those currently under permanent domestic violence restraining orders who are intimate partners of the petitioners. Now, two things are important there. They have to be under permanent domestic violence restraining orders, and those are orders that are issued after a hearing at which the respondent had an opportunity to participate. This is not all domestic violence restraining orders. There's a class called temporary or ex parte or emergency restraining orders that do not fall under that. Furthermore, the definition of intimate partner here is a little bit narrow. It only includes spouses, current or former, people who have had a child with the petitioner, and those who live or lived with the petitioner. So this law covers a very narrow but dangerous group of individuals. The second law, also called the Lautenberg Amendment, prohibits purchase and possession of guns from those convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor. And this is a lifetime ban. Now, here, the definition of intimate partner, those relationships that are covered, is a little bit broader than the domestic violence restraining order law. It also covers parents and guardians, and those similarly situated to a spouse, parent, or guardian. And to qualify, to be a qualifying domestic violence misdemeanor, it has to be a misdemeanor crime committed against one of those groups of people, and the statute that they are charged under has to have as an element the use or attempted use of physical force or threat with a deadly weapon. So even if the crime that the person committed involved force or threat with a deadly weapon, unless the statute they are charged under includes that in the language, they will not qualify for this ban. The states have also passed their own domestic violence gun prohibitions in response to the problem and in response to the federal government passing these laws. Not all states have passed these laws. Often states are more expansive in who they cover than the federal government, not always. The domestic violence restraining order laws for states, for example, often include that other group of restraining orders, those temporary restraining orders that are put in place pretty immediately after one files for a restraining order, and they take place before a hearing at which the respondent had an opportunity to participate. So the defendant, the restraining order respondent, doesn't get a say in this one. And that's pretty unusual in the US justice system, but it is in direct response to the danger that women who file for restraining orders are in. And the second thing that states do that is more expansive than federal government is that they often include current and former dating partners explicitly in their law. For the domestic violence restraining law at the federal level, current and former dating partners are only included if they had a child with the petitioner or if they live or lived with the petitioner. It's unclear whether or not they're covered under the misdemeanor law as people who are similarly situated to a spouse. We just don't know. But this group, current dating partners, constitute about 35% of the intimate partner homicide perpetrators from 1976 to 2005. And the rate of intimate partner homicide for this group has been increasing. So this is also a very important group to cover. 3 studies have looked at the impact of these state laws on intimate partner homicide. Each of the studies looked at about a 20-year period. 2 of them looked at states. The third one looked at large cities in the US. Each of these studies tracked the intimate partner homicide trend throughout this 20-year period and tracked when the laws turned on in the states that have them and saw what happened to this intimate partner homicide trend. Each of these 3 studies found that the domestic violence restraining order gun restriction was associated with reductions in intimate partner homicide committed with guns and total intimate partner homicide. This is important. The result was found in total intimate partner homicide as well. There was no discernible substitution effect, meaning that evidence suggests that would-be killers did not substitute other weapons for guns to affect the same number of killings. Or put another way, evidence suggests that these domestic violence restraining order laws save lives. Now, further analysis suggests that it is purchase. It is the preventing of purchase that saves lives. Some states only prevent or only prohibit possession. And when the analysis was broken down, the effect, the reduction in intimate partner homicide, was seen in states that prohibited purchase, but not those that only prohibited possession. Furthermore, you've heard people talk about this background check system. Furthermore, the impact of the law, the reduction in intimate partner homicide, was only seen in states where the federally licensed firearm dealers had an ability to check the backgrounds of would-be purchasers and get good, accurate, up-to-date information. The domestic violence misdemeanor gun restriction was also looked at in these 3 studies, and unfortunately, there was no measurable impact of this law. It could be because there are just not that many domestic violence misdemeanors for our statistical models to find an effect. It could also be because there's often no domestic violence misdemeanor crime in a state. It's just a misdemeanor crime against a certain type of victim. So it may be hard to identify who the people who should be prohibited are. And there are also likely implementation and enforcement issues that are reducing the potential impact of these laws. So for possession, if someone has a gun and they become a prohibited person, they shouldn't have the gun anymore. They have to get rid of the gun somehow. Research on domestic violence restraining orders, looking at whether or not people who possessed guns had them removed, found that prohibited persons are often not required to surrender their firearms, and guns are not being recovered by law enforcement. Now, there are many steps we can take to improve that, but it suggests that people who possess firearms continue to possess them even if they're prohibited, driving down the potential effectiveness of the law. Furthermore, again with the background check system, you've heard about purchase. Private sellers do not have to check backgrounds to make that transaction happen. So a prohibited person may still purchase that gun from a private seller without any risk of being found out as disqualified. and the gun transaction can go through. Furthermore, that disqualifying misdemeanor or that disqualifying domestic violence restraining order may not be in the background check system. So even if they go to a licensed dealer who can do a background check and does do a background check, their disqualification may not be discovered, and they can still purchase that weapon. So there are reasons to be hopeful. Evidence suggests that that domestic violence restraining order law saves lives, and there are things that we can do to strengthen the effect of it and to strengthen the effect or find an effect of the domestic violence misdemeanor law. We can require all gun purchasers to submit to a background check, whether or not they go through private sellers or federally licensed firearm dealers, so that those who are prohibited remain prohibited. They don't get those firearms. We can also incentivize states to automate the reporting of disqualifications due to domestic violence to the National Instant Background Check System, so that when they do go to the federally licensed firearm dealers, the dealers have complete, accurate, and up-to-date information to determine whether or not they are disqualified. Thinking about purchase, we can also incentivize states to create gun registries or gun purchase databases. When somebody has a firearm and they become prohibited from possessing that firearm, law enforcement and courts need to know that they have a firearm so it can be removed. If law enforcement and courts know that they have these firearms, then they can quickly and safely remove them so that law enforcement is safer and so that victims are safer. But we can also expand the people who are covered by these domestic violence restraining order and misdemeanor laws so that more people are safe. We can extend the domestic violence restraining order prohibitions to temporary domestic violence restraining orders. As I mentioned, these are often called emergency restraining orders. When women file for these restraining orders, they're in danger. They can't often wait the couple days, 3 weeks, in some states, couple months before they get a hearing to get a permanent restraining order. So those temporary restraining orders go into effect. If the federal government covered those temporary restraining orders, then we would be removing firearms from a very dangerous group of people. We could also expand the definition of intimate partners to include former and dating relationships. As I said, the share of intimate partner homicides committed by current dating partners is increasing, and we don't have good data on the number of intimate partner homicides that are committed by former intimate partners. However, given that separation is a very dangerous time, we can assume that quite a few of them are happening. But we can also extend federal gun prohibitions to cover those convicted of misdemeanor stalking. Stalking is an important risk for intimate partner homicide, but many misdemeanor stalking laws do not include, as an element, the use or attempted use of physical force or threat with a deadly weapon. Therefore, they are not included under the federal gun bans. If we changed the laws, if we expanded the laws to cover these three groups of people, we may be able to effect an even greater decrease in intimate partner homicide. But enforcement is a big issue here. Implementation and enforcement. These laws stand or fall on how they are implemented and enforced. So we could provide the resources and support needed for states and local systems to implement and enforce these laws. Possibly a training center where jurisdictions that have gotten it down, that are better at this, can train other jurisdictions on how to do it, on how to have police officers go into the home of somebody who's newly prohibited and gather those firearms that they know they have. If we enforce these laws, along with including more people, more dangerous individuals under the categories that are covered, public safety can be increased and the risk to intimates can be reduced. Thanks.
Thank you, April. I'm going to give our next presentation, and on the topic of reconsidering our current firearm prohibitions, the adequacy of current conditions for legal firearm ownership. The lead author on this paper is Kate Vittes, and my other co-author is John Bernick. Many times in discussing gun policy, it seems as though it gets really dumbed down into an assumption that really doesn't make sense or is true. We have on the one hand a set of hardened criminals, right? These are the bad guys with guns, and they're all supposed to be prohibited from being able to purchase or possess a firearm. On the other hand, we have your law-abiding gun owner, and sort of not much in between there. But what I hope to do today is impress upon you that the world isn't necessarily as neat as these little boxes in our gun policy, and if we're going to have the biggest impact in reducing homicides and other violence, we have to really reconsider how well our prohibitions are doing in identifying the highest risk individuals. Very briefly, and Professor Cook covered this already, so I'll just try to be quick. The federal firearm prohibitions for firearms include, of course, felons, fugitives from justice, as April just described, the domestic violence restrictions, as was discussed earlier in detail, the restrictions for those who are seriously mentally ill, those who have been dishonorably discharged from the armed forces, illegal aliens, and perhaps most importantly, in order to possess handguns, you're supposed to be at least 18 years of age. Separately, if you're going to purchase a handgun from a licensed firearm dealer, you have to be at least 21 years of age. And then finally, in federal law, those who are identified as addicted or users of controlled substances. As far as how this gets operationalized, at least the last component with users of controlled substances, the regulations say you can be prohibited if you've been convicted for use or possession of a controlled substance within the past year or had 2 or more arrests for such offenses within the past 5 years, if the most recent arrest has been within the past year. Or, and this applied to Gerald Loeffner in the Tucson shooting, you've been found through a drug test to have used a controlled substance unlawfully. So, my colleagues and I recently published a study that looked at gun offenders who are in state prisons. And we wanted to look at the 13 states whose laws with respect to who can and cannot legally possess firearms pretty much mirrored the federal laws, or in, I think maybe a couple of cases may have been weaker. So in these states, in these 13 states, we found in this black portion of the pie chart, 40% were prohibited from being able to possess a firearm. So that leaves 60% of individuals committing gun violence who previously were not prohibited. Roughly equal proportions of the remainder of that involved a set of individuals who wouldn't have been prohibited under any kind of set of restrictions currently under law in any of the 50 states. However, what's most interesting, I think, and what we try to probe is this 29% who would have been prohibited had these 13 states applied the more stricter standards that are in place in states with stricter gun laws. Particularly interesting is sort of how this broke down within that overall 29% of gun offenders in these states. The biggest portion of this were individuals who were in this 18 to 20-year-old age range, so that had the minimum age for possession been 21, they would have been prohibited. So around 17% fell into that category. About 7% were users of long guns in that younger age group. roughly 5% had been convicted of a serious crime in juvenile courts, something that would have been in an adult court considered a felony. And then around 4% had been convicted of a violent or gun crime that would have been a misdemeanor crime. And then a little less than 2% would have been disqualified because they had been convicted of 2 or more drug or alcohol-related misdemeanors. So using these data, we wanted to think about, are additional exclusion criteria justifiable? Top of the list, again, sort of based on the data, might be whether we should set 21 as a minimum age for possessing handguns. Other criteria would be convictions for misdemeanors involving violence or guns. And if you'd been convicted, I use convicted in courts because that's not the terminology they use in juvenile court, but basically found to have committed a serious crime within juvenile court or had multiple convictions for drug or alcohol crimes. So I just want to briefly go over a little bit of data to shows why these are important high-risk groups. What this graph here shows you is the age-specific rate of homicide offending. And what you'll see here, in quite dramatic fashion really, how dramatically homicide offending goes up during the teen years. And it peaks, interestingly, between the ages of 18 and 20. This is precisely the group that you could conceivably affect by a stricter standard of 21 setting as a minimum legal age for purchase and possession of handguns. I think one other thing important to note when you look at this age offending curve, of course, is how rapidly it drops off over time as people get older. And what that suggests is that if you start to consider expanding your prohibitions, it may be quite justifiable and maybe politically wise to think about these as they don't necessarily have to be lifelong prohibitions from legal gun ownership if they generally avoid involvement in crime. So beer versus guns, which is more dangerous in the hands of 18 to 20-year-olds? In all 50 of our states, 21 is the minimum legal age for consumption of alcohol. This is probably largely attributable to the effective advocacy of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who are fed up with all the death that had occurred due to underage drinking. I think in a hope that perhaps we're at a similar time right now when we think about gun violence in this country. On only 5 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have we set 21 as the minimum legal age for handgun possession. So what about youth who are found to have committed serious crimes in juvenile courts? There's a number of studies that find that committing serious crime at a young age is a reasonably robust predictor of subsequent violence. And as we noted before in the graph, the risk declines with age quite substantially. So again, maybe we can think about time-limited prohibitions. And many states that have these types of laws do indeed do that. In Massachusetts, for example, has a period of 5 years that bans firearm possession for such individuals. In California and Pennsylvania, they have the prohibition up until age 30, which again is very consistent with the age offending curves. By the way, I showed you homicide offending. Other violent crime offending, particularly robbery, looks very similar to the homicide offending. So what about alcohol and drug abusers? Right now, many such individuals can legally possess guns. We know from a variety of studies that being a dependent or an alcohol or drug abuser greatly increases your risk. This is just one graphical depiction comparing the prevalence of alcohol and drug dependence among violent offenders in local jails in comparison to the general population. Quite stark differences there. Similarly, alcohol is a very important risk factor for intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide. This shows you the prevalence of alcohol abuse in the first bar there being where there's no intimate partner violence, the yellow bar with prior physical abuse, and the red bar with intimate partner homicide. So alcohol plays a very important role in violence, and if we can keep guns out of the hand of such abusers, I think we'll save a lot of lives. Garen Wintemute is going to cover this, so I'm just going to say very briefly that we know that misdemeanors, particularly violent misdemeanors, have a much higher rate for offending, and he'll get into that more in his talk just right after this one. So what's the evidence about broadening categories for prohibited firearm possessors? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of research that looks at prohibiting firearm possession on specific high-risk groups. We have here, April earlier presented the research on domestic violence restraining orders. Dr. Wintemute is going to talk to us in a minute about what do we know about restricting gun possession by violent misdemeanors. But I think it's important to recognize that any such policy effects are going to be much more likely to be effective when you have other policies in place that prohibit these illegal transactions, and we'll be covering that ground too in subsequent talks. The policy implications. I think, again, there's clear evidence that the current prohibitions don't take us where we need to be to really protect our citizens from gun violence. Stricter standards could greatly increase the number of who are at risk of gun offending, and we have some evidence that denying firearm possession for those groups, firearm purchase, does reduce violence. As I said before, these prohibitions may not need to be lifelong, and I think perhaps our most important issue to wrestle with is the minimum age for handgun possession. I think personally it should be 21. It's quite logical just based upon what we know about adolescent and young adult development. But even if you don't have outright prohibitions for that group, it also could be wise to think about whether there might be extra conditions placed upon their firearm possession given that it is a high-risk group. So I will stop there and now introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Garen Wintemute. Dr. Wintemute, in my opinion, is one of the most creative, bold thinkers when it comes to gun violence and gun policy research. He's just contributed an enormous amount of very important work. I'm so glad that he's going to share it with us today. Thank you, Garen.
So while he's setting up, if Daniel's right, then it's true of thinkers, unlike crop dusters and others, that there are old, bold thinkers. So I had some introductory remarks about giving honor to memory and funding is hard to get and so on. But I learned from my mentor to many of us, the man responsible for my career in the business, Steve Terrett, and the careers of Daniel and Jan and others, that taking one's introductory remarks and wadding them up and throwing them away at the beginning of a talk can be a way to get everybody's attention. So, Steve, thank you and payback. I am going to say this. Thank you to all of you for coming and to the people who are watching on C-SPAN. This really isn't a conference about what we all know. This is a conference about what you all are going to do. And to the extent that we can help with that, that's our job and we're happy to do it. But please take what you learn here today and tomorrow and do something with it. Now, we're going to, this talk is going to build very closely on several that you've just heard. It's going to build directly on Daniel's remarks. We're going to be talking about a population that I think it's useful to call not so law-abiding gun owners. People who in one way or another fall through that crack that Daniel very nicely outlined. They're not prohibited. They have some criminal activity. What goes on with those people? I come from California, a state where that takes very seriously its role as a laboratory of democracy, a state where we have good data, where those data are made available to researchers, and where, bless their hearts, the legislature says, so what's the latest evidence, so we can turn that into policy. And those who have worked with me there know that I'm not making that stuff up. So let's get started. We go to a great deal of trouble here in the United States to detect and deny purchases, and you've heard the details. I'm not going to go back through them. We conducted almost 11 million background checks in 2009. We denied 150,000 of them. But the question really is, do we deny enough? Phil Cook in his tape mentioned evidence from California that caused them to relook at those findings. Well, I'm that evidence. I basically sketched out on the back of an envelope that given the narrow scope of the current denial criteria, that even if you assume really high rates of badness among people who are denied, it's probably impossible for their method to have found an effect. Daniel and others have mentioned, but it's a point worth reemphasizing, most people who are interviewed when they are incarcerated for a crime, violent crime committed with a firearm, when they are interviewed and asked, where did you get the gun that you used in committing that crime? Most of those people are not prohibited from purchasing firearms at the time they commit the crime for which they are incarcerated. We're going to look at 3 studies. We're doing some science here, folks, and I'm going to move fast, so hang on. The first, I'm sorry, there are 3 questions. Let me go back just for one moment. There are 3 questions that I'm going to address with these 3 studies. The first is, and I've sort of given you a hint to my thinking about the answer. The first is, do the current denial criteria cover the entire population at risk? I'm just going to show you a little bit more detail about why that answer is no. Number 2 is, how often do people who purchase firearms legally, who pass a background check, then go on to become prohibited persons? Does that happen often enough to matter? Should we do something about it? The answer is yes, and I'll show you a little bit about that. And finally, I'm going to end on the up note. Do these policies work? Does it actually make a difference to screen people who are attempting to purchase firearms, and deny purchases by prohibited persons? And as Daniel mentioned, I'm picking up where he left off. That answer is yes. So first study, addressing the question, do the current prohibitions cover the populations at risk? Bear with me a second. Many slides have this format, so I'm going to take a moment to set this up, and then I'll highlight differences. We did a series of cohort studies in California, which has good data. We know who buys handguns, at least if they go through a retailer. We know the day on which they first could have acquired that gun. Those data are made available for research purposes, can be linked to criminal records. We can do some serious science with that kind of information. The first of the 3 studies looked at people who legally purchased handguns in California in 1977. Some of those people were, in the definition that I'm going to use here, law-abiding gun owners. These people had never been convicted of a crime. There was another group of people who passed a background check, who had convictions for 1 or more misdemeanor crimes, which in California at that time were not grounds for denial, and in the rest of the United States, with the exception of domestic violence, they are not grounds for denial today. We followed those 4 people forward in time for 15 years, and you've probably already worked your way all the way through to the results. What I'm presenting for you here are the percentages of those handgun purchasers stratified by whether or not they had been convicted of a crime, who were arrested. We use arrest as our outcome measure over the ensuing 15 years, broken down by type of crime. So as you can see, about 10% of those with no prior criminal history were arrested for any type of crime, 2.5% arrested for a violent crime index crime. The violent crime index crimes are murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And as you can see, the raw percentages for people with any conviction for any kind of offense, no matter what kind of offense or how many convictions, the increase in just the raw incidence of events was by a factor of about 5. So 10% of those with no prior conviction arrested for something, 50% of those with 1 or more prior convictions for something arrested for something. So stick with me as we move forward. We're on that same study. We are now moving from absolute risk and percentages to relative risk. And I'm going to step over to the board, to the screen. Tell me if you can hear me in the back. Can you follow? I'm coming back to the podium. And I'm sorry, I left my laser in Sacramento, so if anybody has a laser, I'll steal it. The mouse is a laser. Oh, the cursor, got it. Hey, okay. What was that about bold thinkers? Yeah, next time I'll keep my mouth shut. All right, this is the same study population. We're looking at relative risks. But this time, there we are. We've got prior convictions broken down in two different ways. So prior convictions not involving a gun and not involving violence in this group. And this group further broken down, I keep losing the cursor. This group further broken down by whether they have one or two or more such convictions and nothing worse than that, okay? Then we have a group that have prior convictions for offenses that involve guns, but not violence, carrying a concealed firearm, let's say, and again broken down by whether they have one such conviction or two or more. And then finally, if you will, at the apex of criminality, those who have convictions for violent offenses. But remember, I am talking about people who purchased handguns legally, passed a background check. These are all misdemeanor crimes, and then again, one or more. Now, we are moving from percentages to relative risk, and I'm sorry for those of you who eat and breathe relative risks. Not all of us in the room do. In this case, we're not talking about percentages, we're talking about ratios. So, and our comparison group here in all cases is the law-abiding gun purchasers, those with no prior criminal record. So on the top line here, even those who had one prior misdemeanor conviction, and that for an offense that involved neither guns nor violence, were essentially 6 times as likely as the law-abiding gun owners to be arrested for something, and sort of in the 5 range right on across. Notice, and I'm going to stick with this group just for a second, what we call a dose-response relationship, and I'll put it in plain English. The badder you were before, the greater the risk that you were going to be bad later, at least to some extent. The relative risks in this 2+ group are higher than they are in the 1 group. Again, always compared to handgun purchasers with no prior criminal record. Now, let me skip down all the way to the bottom. Those with prior misdemeanor convictions for violent offenses, 1, 2, or more, and let's just go all the way to the bottom of the table. 11 times as likely as the law-abiding gun owners over 15 years to be arrested for a violent offense, basically the same, and 15 times as likely to be arrested on a charge of murder, rape, robbery, or aggravated assault. These are all legal handgun purchasers. This study was done with data from 1977 to 1992. California has since changed its denial criteria. We're going to focus on that in just a moment. But I would point out that with the exception of the addition of DV misdemeanors in the mid-90s and under federal law, this is the population that is purchasing firearms in most of the rest of the United States today. Now, our second question, how often do legal purchasers of handguns become prohibited persons? Another cohort study done in California from 1991 forward. By this time, California has changed its denial criteria and no longer allows the purchase of firearms, we look at all firearms, by persons with a history of a misdemeanor violent conviction. And we're going to look at the impact of that policy change as our third study, but we're going to start with this one. So in this case, we have a little over 7,200 purchasers, about 4,500 with no criminal record, 2,700 with any kind of criminal history at all, an arrest, et cetera. But we're going to look for our follow-up purposes just at those with prior convictions. We followed these people from 91 through sort of 1996. Among those who had a prior conviction, 21% were arrested, 4.5%, just shy of 5%, were convicted of a prohibiting offense within 5 years. It was interesting, I'm just going to mention this as an aside, to look to see in these data that, as always is the case, age and the extent of the prior criminal history were both important predictors of risk of criminal activity in the future, such that if you compared our oldest group, those ages 35 to 49, this was entirely people under the age of 50, if you compared our oldest age group, and specifically in that group those who had no prior criminal record, to our youngest age group, those ages 21 to 24 with multiple prior convictions, risk of arrest varied by a factor of 200. The law treats all these people the same. Let's look at some outcomes. Now, we are looking at prior record, risk of a new conviction, but again, while we have convictions stratified here, people, the law-abiding gun owners and our, with a varying number, previously convicted legal purchasers of firearms, and there are no violent misdemeanors in this system. Our background check system works pretty well. We are looking here, the numbers are small like the relative risks I showed you on the last slide, but we are looking at percentages. So this is the percentage of purchasers stratified by their prior criminal history characteristics who become prohibited persons within 5 years. For those with 3 or more, it's 7%. And these are people who are convicted for murder, rape, robbery, or aggravated assault. 7.3% of 10 million people is a lot of people, it would seem to me. And I need to point out that on several grounds, these are underestimates. First off, indictments are not in here as there are prohibiting events. They're not in here for our follow-up. We're only looking at convictions. Domestic violence restraining orders are not in here. Convictions that occur out of state are not in here. This is California. These are California-only data. And probably the most important thing, we're only looking at 5 years. Lots of arrests have not been fully adjudicated. And finally, so all of that leads to an underestimation based just for California, but it's further an underestimation for the rest of the United States because our denial criteria are stricter than most states are. The violent misdemeanors are not in here. Now we can scale this up a little bit. In California, for the last 5 years or so, we've actually had a program that tracks people who have in the past legally purchased firearms and have since become prohibited persons, and in selected cases actually tries to go get their guns back. That program has confiscated thousands of firearms from thousands of people. We know the process evaluation. Our group is hoping to do the outcome evaluation. You get the model here. Are the people from whom firearms are recovered less likely to do crime than others? We'll see. But there are, we have a rolling list in California of people who've recently become prohibited, who are known because they're in the state's archive of handgun purchase records. We don't have long guns, but we're adding them. We have a list of about 20,000 people, recently prohibited, et cetera, et cetera. We're about 10% of the population. Just do that simple math, and there might be 200-some thousand people like this around the country, about which I suspect something ought to be done. Last study, we'll end on the happy note. Does screening people and preventing purchases work? We're going to look here at the results of that policy change I mentioned, in which California enacted a new criterion for prohibition based on prior conviction for a violent misdemeanor. We have two groups of people. All of the members of both groups sought to purchase handguns in California. Our treatment group, if you will, sought to purchase handguns in the first year of the new policy. Under the terms of the new policy, their purchases were denied. The control group sought to purchase guns in the 2 years, as it turns out, prior to the institution of the new policy, old policy, their purchases were allowed. Other than that difference, the two groups were almost eerily similar in demographics and so on. We set an age restriction of under age 35. Why mess with old guys? They don't do crime. Obviously, we took as a null hypothesis that there would be no difference in risk of arrest. And I'm going to give you just a snapshot. All of this stuff is published and available. We are again looking at relative risks, but I'm throwing another curve at you here. We have some characteristics over here, our entire study population, young people, et cetera. The referent group is not on the chart. The referent group in this case for each line of data is persons with that characteristic whose purchases were denied. You are looking at relative risks for purchasers relative to denied persons. Everybody with me on that? I've twisted this format quite a bit. So what we have here is, in plain English, across the board, people whose purchases were allowed, 30% increase in risk for arrest for a gun or violent crime over the 3 years of follow-up. Among those ages 21 and 24, where the absolute rates are highest. In our state, you can't buy a handgun if you're under 21, and you saw Daniel's graph, a 40% increase in risk if you got your gun. If you had one prior conviction, 30%. If you had a whole passel of prior convictions, an 80% increase in risk if you got your gun. One violence conviction, 40%. There's one group for which we did not see, and there's a much longer list of subsets for which we did not see this effect, and that is among people who had 3 or more prior convictions for firearm-related or violent misdemeanors. In that group, denial did not make a difference. And I suspect that this might well be the group who, if they can't get a gun from a dealer, by golly, they are going to go out and get somebody because they are involved in a career, and they're not going to be deterred. I'm going to very briefly mention our findings. Current denial criteria don't cover the population. Purchasers become prohibited persons frequently enough to matter. Background checks work. Here's what I think we ought to do. It's mostly been mentioned. We should expand denial criteria to include convictions for violent misdemeanors. We'll make NICS checks better. I'm not going to talk about delayed denials. If I have time, I'll talk about it when we do gun shows. This I want to take 1 minute and mention. We need to avoid a problem of false eligibility that is embedded in the current legislation, the Fixed Gun Checks Act, that is promoted as a solution for this problem. The Fixed Gun Checks Act is described as requiring a background check for every gun purchase. In my judgment, it does not do that. It allows a person to waive the background check and purchase a firearm if they are in one of about 17 states and have a nominally unexpired, it still says on the card that it's valid, permit to carry a concealed firearm or a similar permit. I've still got the card in my wallet, but as we've all learned, a lot can happen in 5 years, and there are thousands of people walking around the United States, I would suspect, who have those unexpired cards, who are in fact prohibited persons, who've recently become prohibited because they've been convicted of a violent crime, and whose risk of recidivism is higher at that moment than it will be at any time in the future, and those people should be going through a background check. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to open this up for questions for about 10 minutes or so. I know everybody is probably getting hungry, like I am. But I know many of you are experts yourselves and have questions and issues that you might want to raise for any of the panelists. So I invite you now. We have some folks with microphones on the aisles who will... So maybe we'll start on the end over here with this.
Hello. Question. Does the current government consideration of what I'll just call knock and block laws, which would allow the police to recover guns in the homes of individuals who are particularly high-risk individuals, it seems to be leading to a response on the other side of lock and block, of individuals who are on the fringe end of gun owners, who are running out, purchasing large quantities of guns, locking them away to block the government from gaining access to those guns in a recovery fashion. So can you discuss knock and block on the government side and how it's now led to lock and block on the gun fringe side?
Garen's going to tackle this one here.
I'll take it. Is the mic on? Okay. Thanks for the question. California has something called an armed and prohibited persons system. It's what I briefly alluded to. When a person is convicted of a prohibiting offense or they're served with a restraining order, notification is sent to Sacramento. Within a couple of days, the state has searched its archive of handgun purchases, assault weapon registrations, other databases, to determine if there's any evidence that this person has purchased firearms in the past. We've learned that those systems are not perfect. There are lots of gun owners who aren't in the system, but it's what we have and we're making it better. Every time there's a hit, notification is sent to the local law enforcement agency. You've got an armed and prohibited person in your jurisdiction. Up to that jurisdiction, what they want to do, and we're hoping to pull together the state's experience with that. But the Department of Justice has its own squad that in selected cases goes out. Last year alone, they recovered more than 2,000 firearms from recently prohibited people. They've been doing it for 5 years. There has yet to be an injury associated with that program. To their knowledge, and these people are friends of mine, we talk all the time, to their knowledge, there has not been a single instance of retaliatory violence related to that program. What we don't know is the outcome in terms of risk of criminal activity. We just don't have that information. But at a process level, it's been working for 5 years.
Okay.
Yes, good morning. Louis Faison speaking, and I wanted to first of all, thank you for this conference. It was worth the very early morning plane ride from Boston. This antipathy to gun control seems to have been developing over years, maybe decades, and has become sort of ingrained in our society, which brings up a number of questions, and I just have two to propose. The first is, do we have to just look at this as part of social discourse, a little bit like the drinking and driving, so that friends don't let friends drive drunk, and designated drivers, sort of some kind of new way of discussing guns in society, which becomes very socially acceptable. And the second would be, since this is so ingrained, and it may take some years to change this whole process of gun control, is there a quick technologic fix? Is there some, I won't say a silver bullet, is there some kind of thing, a pin on weapons or a fingerprint or some way use technology, modern technology, to make a quicker change than might come through long-term change in social discourse?
Okay, thank you for your question. At least one aspect of the more technological fix, if you will, that you alluded to, we will be covering in an afternoon panel with a presentation by Professor Stephen Terrett. So maybe we'll hold that portion until his presentation. One thing, I think there's only so many things you can cover in one summit or a book that we're going to do. The thing I probably most regret that we don't have in here is anything about the notion of microstamping ammunition and cartridges. That this is a new technology that would make it far more much easier to connect who shot that bullet in any given case, and could be a significant deterrent to violence, as well as, of course, helping police solve crimes and get violent offenders off the streets. But your first part of your question alluded to more having to do with social changes and things like that. And clearly, I think that almost any public health success story that gets told in this institution typically has two components to it. There's a policy aspect of that success story, and then there's a sort of social norms component that go hand in hand. And I think in order to make the biggest reductions in gun violence, we're going to have to focus on both of those sides. Most of our discussions in this summit, we're going to focus more on the policy component, but it's certainly occurred to me that, the thing that we all talking about, and we'll talk about after lunch as well, this idea of private sales without background checks. There ought to be a law. Of course there should be a law. But you know what? Even a social norm, even in states where it is legal, I'd sort of like to think with all of these responsible gun owners, and there are plenty of responsible gun owners, that people would sort of speak out, like, that's a really sort of immoral thing to do, to sell a gun without a background check. I heard through someone that there's a gun owner in Maine who sort of has a campaign along those lines on a voluntary basis. So I think we can and should make some progress on both sides.
Can I add a
Certainly.
comment?
Go
Thank
for it.
you. So I think it's an excellent point, and it deals with the problem that we have lots of guns in this country that are legally owned. And what we want to do is engage people in conversations so that they can make enlightened decisions in their own interest. There's a project in New Hampshire that Catherine Barber and Mary Verniotis are running through the Harvard Injury Center, where they've worked with gun shops to get the people who sell guns in these gun shops to put out brochures and posters about the risks of suicide with a gun. That encourages conversations. It gives them information about who to call if they're having trouble or they're worried about somebody else. And just like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving movement that changed whether it was acceptable for me to tell you, you're drunk, give me the keys, I'll drive you home, or to have a designated driver. We've got to get to a point through civic, civil, and factually grounded conversation where it's just as logical for me to tell you, I know you've been going through a hard time, you're going through a divorce, your kid has just failed a grade, broke up with his girlfriend, looks depressed. Let me help you get rid of that gun temporarily until the crisis passes. And what we need to do is to build an infrastructure that makes it easy for people to actually act in their enlightened self-interest once they recognize the trade-offs that having a gun in the home entails. And there are impediments, structural impediments to doing that could easily be overcome, or at least are worth working on. For example, if as a physician I have someone in my office and they tell me, you know what, I'm worried about myself or my child, I want to get rid of these guns, there isn't an easy way for me to say, okay, bring your guns so-and-so, or I'll have someone come and get them. We need to decrease the barriers for people to act in a way that is in accordance with what they think is best for the people in their home. And it'll make it easier when we have a conversation for people to recognize what they need to do. What we need to do is build an infrastructure to allow them to do that more easily.
Excellent point. Thank you. We're going to take one more quick question and hopefully quick response, and then we'll break for lunch.
Hello. I'm a national academic who has spent the last several years studying the financial crisis and the effects on our society. And I want to just interject this idea of Main Street. 85% of people have lost trust in their institutions, government and corporate. And it has to do with wealth inequality. We know, all of us in Main Street understand, that wealth inequality was largely driven by massive corporate fraud that has yet to be recovered. And it's caused such an instability in our society that we have such a deepening third world poverty, and that is what is going to be driving a lot of these crimes and violent gun statistics in the future. Now, I also would suggest that as we think to ourselves, why are ordinary people buying AK-47s and things like that? It is because of that lack of trust in government and our institutions. So I am asking the panel and all of the people who are going to drive what we all know is a great program of gun control. The bad guys at the top of the social stratus are driving the problem. And if we look only regressively at how to control individuals who are going to be pressed into desperate situations, we aren't going to solve the problem. So please consider justice, rule of law, as the primary driver of the problem we have at hand right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So clearly there are many determinants of violence aside from guns. And I don't think anyone here would argue otherwise. However, I don't think that some people have used that kind of argument, though, as sort of why bother? Because it's all about root causes. But it's not only with violence. There are a number of public health problems that have these similar kind of injustices and inequalities at their roots. But we found in many instances that you can apply very effective things that save lives before you even can deal with all of those much more difficult issues. So we are going to focus today on what are the things we can do with respect to gun policy that will save lives. So I think we're gonna break for lunch now. I've been told that there are lunches in Finestone Hall, which is to your left as you exit here. Where else? Finestone Hall is where you'll find lunch. So we're going to reconvene to start again at 1:35. So hope everybody will be here in time so we can get rolling.
No. Well, maybe pick it up there and then post it. Yeah,